Hey, what is going on guys? Danny here, welcome back to the channel. In this video, I'll be showing you guys some gaming benchmarks which I conducted on my Ryzen system using various DDR4 memory speeds. Timestamps will be in the video description down below, so check them out if there's a certain point in the video that you want to jump to. The reason why I want to explore this topic and make a video about it was because RAM has become a significantly important component to consider if you are building a PC these days, especially if it's a system using AMD's Ryzen CPUs. Ryzen CPUs in particular are known to benefit the most when paired with a fast kit of RAM due to their architecture and their design. Most importantly, this is because of the multi-CCX design of the Ryzen and Threadripper CPUs. Take for example a Ryzen 7 1800X, an 8-core 16-thread processor. This CPU is comprised of two quad-core complexes. Now the internal CCX core-to-core communication speed is comparable to what you'd see on Intel's ring bus architecture. But when it comes to AMD's Infinity Fabric, the thing that's connecting the two CCXs together, its speed is dependent on the RAM speed that you have paired with your CPU. Infinity Fabric operates at half the memory speed and is directly proportional with it. Therefore, by running a faster kit of RAM, you can increase the speed at which the two CCXs communicate with each other, thus improving performance in various applications. This is crucial because in your operating system, the CPU will be juggling around tasks throughout numerous threads, and it has to pass information through the Infinity Fabric. So with faster RAM, you can ensure there's no bottleneck there. Now do keep in mind, just because one application or game might show significantly better performance with faster RAM, doesn't necessarily mean everything else will. It all depends on how the program utilizes your system's resources and how it's been optimized. But that's basically the deal with Ryzen and faster RAM in a nutshell, and why you might have seen so much discussion on what type of memory kit you should be buying when building a Ryzen-based system. Since AMD had released their first generation Ryzen processors last year in 2017, the officially supported specified DRAM configurations went up to 2666 MHz for single rank kits and 2400 MHz for dual rank kits. But with the recent launch of the second generation Ryzen 2000 Pinnacle Rich processors, AMD have officially increased the supported DRAM configuration to 2933 MHz due to improvements made to the memory controller. Along with that, manufacturers like Asus, Gigabyte, and MSI were also listing their own specified DRAM configurations that are possible on their motherboards. That should hopefully give you guys a background on everything. There are a lot of benchmarks I need to get through, so let's move on to system specifications and testing methodology. So for my test system, I'm running a Ryzen 7 1800X, which I've overclocked to 4.05 GHz, paired with a Noctua NHD15, which does a pretty good job at keeping the CPU cool. For the RAM, I'm using a single rank 16GB 2x8 kit from G-Skill. This is a Trident Z kit with Samsung B-Die memory, which is advertised to run at 3200 MHz with a cast latency rating of 14. The motherboard that I've used is the Gigabyte X370 Gaming 5, and it's running the latest F23F BIOS, which has the newest revision of the Agiza 1002 microcode update. For the graphics card, I'll be using the EVGA GTX 1080 Ti SC Black Edition, which has plus 100 MHz to the core and plus 350 MHz to the memory. Powering the components is an EVGA 750W G2 power supply, and for the case housing all the components is the Corsair Air 740, providing ample airflow to keep everything nice and cool. Moving on, the test methodology for these benchmarks is fairly straightforward. I tested 21 popular games of various genres that have been released over the last few years. These games consist of open world titles, action adventures, first-person, third-person shooters, and some racing games. All of these games, with the exception of one, were benchmarked at a resolution of 1080p with high settings and not ultra, so we wouldn't run into any GPU bottlenecking there. I also didn't want to test at 720p as I wanted results that represented more of a realistic scenario. I tested all of these games using 7 different RAM speeds: 2133, 2400, 2666, 2933, 3200, and 3333 MHz. Now all of these frequencies were tested with the RAM in XMP mode with the auto timing mode enabled. This would allow the RAM to run its primary timings at 14, 14, 14, 34, and then set rest of the timings accordingly as the frequency was increased. However, to make things a bit more interesting, for the fastest frequency, 3333 MHz, I ran the benchmarks again, but this time I also tightened the timings manually, hence the 7 RAM speeds tested. When running the benchmarks, an average of 3 runs were taken to ensure consistency with the results. Alright, so now that I've gone over the system specifications and test methodology, it's time we moved on to what you've all been waiting for, the gaming benchmarks. Starting things off is Battlefield 1, and this title shows pretty good memory scaling. 2133 MHz shows just how much slow memory can hold back a Ryzen processor in BF1, where just bumping up the frequency to 2400 MHz yields an increase of 10% for the average frame rate, and the 1% and 0.1% lows show a relatively similar boost. From 2933 MHz to 3333 MHz with auto timings, the frame times showed little to no improvement, with the average frame rate increasing incrementally as you would expect. Still, you can see just how much ground is covered when increasing the memory from say 2133 MHz all the way to 3200 MHz. There's a difference of 25% in terms of average frame rate, and with our 1% low results showing an even larger gap at 28%. But taking things even further are the Titan timings, where at the same frequency of 3333 MHz, which is already quite fast, we see a difference of 9% for the average FPS, with a 13% boost for the 1% and 0.1% lows respectively. Not bad at all, and I'm happy to see what fast memory and tight timings can do for this title. Next up, we have TitanFall 2, a fantastic first-person shooter in my opinion, which unfortunately got neglected due to a poor release window, and it being dwarfed by the popularity of other FPS titles. As for the results, not much needs to be said about the average frame rate, where once we hit 2933 MHz and above, we have no trouble hitting the game's 144 FPS cap. The 1% low results show very little improvement as we increase RAM frequency, but it's the 0.1% results that are the most intriguing here. Going from 2933 MHz to 3200 MHz yields a performance boost of about 17%, and anything past that shows little to no improvement. But for TitanFall 2, you can rest easy as this title seems to be pretty much GPU bound, and that even 2133 MHz RAM shows pretty good performance from the start. Moving on, we have a great looking action-adventure title, Rise of the Tomb Raider, and this is another title which seems to show how much of a difference fast RAM can make. Average frame rate and 1% low results seems to show relatively incremental increases with speeds up to 3333 MHz with auto timings, but 2400 MHz and 2133 MHz frequency show the worst results for the 0.1% lows, as we see drops into the mid-40s, which isn't particularly bad per se, but the experience is a whole lot better when using speeds past 2400 MHz with the results north of 60 FPS. Just like Battlefield 1, Rise of the Tomb Raider showed a considerable leap in performance across all three measured stats when the timings were tightened, where the average FPS showed an increase of 15%, the 1% and 0.1% lows increasing 24% and 18% respectively. So by tightening the timings, you're also ensuring a very smooth gaming experience here. The next game we'll be looking at is one of the most popular open world titles, and that's Grand Theft Auto 5. A fairly old game by now considering the Xbox 360 and PS3 versions came out back in 2013, but I still wanted to include it considering just how many people are still playing it. The results here show what you'd expect as you increase RAM speed, and judging from these results, as long as you have memory that is at least running at 2933 MHz, you should be able to attain a pretty solid experience here. Tightening the timings didn't have much of an effect except for yielding better frame times. Onwards to Hitman 2016, a game which can be pretty hard on the CPU because many of the levels in this game are set up in such a way where you'll end up encountering a ton of NPCs on screen at the same time. Going from 2133 MHz to 2933 MHz shows a pretty good boost in performance for the average frame rate. We're looking at an improvement of 23% with our frame times showing small bumps. After that point, increasing the RAM frequency only improves things marginally, but tightening the timings yields much better performance, with a 12% bump for the average frame rate and 1% lows, plus a 23% increase for the 0.1% low results. After Hitman, we have a few racing games. Kicking things off is Dirt 4, and it's a game that's been known to play pretty well with AMD hardware. For this game, a considerable jump in performance can be seen when raising the RAM frequency from 2666 MHz to 2933 MHz for the three measured stats, and then from that point on, only the average frame rate shows an increase of 6%, with the 1% and 0.1% low results staying relatively the same. Tightening the timings and running the RAM at 3333 MHz shows an increase of 8% for the average frame rate, and the 1% and 0.1% lows also show an increase unlike the three previous configurations right before it, where we see an increase of 6% and 9% respectively. The second racing game on our list is F1 2017. With the memory running at 2133 MHz, you can see just how bottlenecked things get here, because simply going up to 2400 MHz shows a comparable 0.1% frame time result when compared with the other configurations. As we move up, the average and 1% low results show us incremental improvements, Unlike previous titles though, tightening the timings doesn't impact performance significantly, especially when taking into account the 0.1% lows. Still, you have to consider just how much of a difference there is between the first and last RAM configurations. There is a massive 40% increase for the average frame rate and 35% increase for the 1% minimums. Project Cars 2 is up next, and this game really had me scratching my head. And I actually ended up benchmarking this title 5 times for each run because I was just shocked to see the differences with these results. Taking a look at the difference between the average frame rate between tightened and auto timings, and we see an absolutely massive difference there. Looking at the RAM configurations from 2133 MHz to 2666 MHz, we see good overall improvements to the average frame rate. But then things seem to taper off. We only see slight improvements at 2933 and onwards. Throughout all the runs, the 0.1% lows seem to have showed little to no improvement, with the 1% lows improving considerably up until 2666 MHz. But simply tightening the timings past 3333 MHz showed just how much this game benefits from low latency RAM configurations. 3333 MHz with tightened timings yields an average frame rate that is 23% greater than 3333 MHz with auto timing mode enabled. Very bizarre, as this was one of the only titles in this entire benchmark suite which showed these gains, but if it's a positive one, then I welcome it. Alright, finally the last racing game we'll be taking a look at is Forza Horizon 3. I decided to mix it up a bit and threw in an open world racing game which is set in the beautiful lands of Australia, because the previous racing games were all closed circuit racing type of games. So this will allow us to see what kind of impacts different memory configurations will have on this type of game. Forza Horizon 3 is a game that takes advantage of the DirectX 12 API and for the most part is GPU bound. And that seems to be evident here, as playing the game with faster RAM, although does yield some good improvements, it's not as drastic as we've seen with other titles in this genre. It appears as though there are certain steps in RAM speed that will net you noticeable improvements, such as going from 2400 to 2666 and 2933 to 3200 MHz show us similar results. But if we were to go from 2133 to 2400 MHz, there would hardly be any noticeable improvements there. Also, the frame times do show good overall improvement over the course of increasing RAM speeds, but I'll have to say they're a bit deceptive, and here's why. When you drive in the map of Australia, there's numerous events that are marked on the land, and certain events which get triggered automatically as you drive by them, such as speed traps, drift zones, jump cams, and more. And what I've noticed is that when those events occur, the screen flashes, and this is what actually causes the frame times to spike. It's not really a problem with performance, it's just how the game is designed. Now that we've gotten through those racing games, let's move away and take a look at an RTS, for which we have none other than Ashes of the Benchmark. This is a very CPU bound title and does a good job at scaling with multiple threads. If one wants to attain the best possible performance in this title and wants to use the Ryzen CPU to its full potential, a fast RAM kit with good timings is highly recommended. Running the RAM at 3333 MHz with tightened timings shows a dramatic improvement for the average frame rate. We're looking at a 51% improvement. Also note the 34% increase for the 1% minimums when timings are simply lowered. Moving on, the next game in our benchmark suite is Gears of War 4, one of my favorite third-person shooters. This title came along with the Xbox One release, part of Microsoft's Play Anywhere program, and unfortunately didn't do that well due to issues a lot of people had with the Windows Store. The player base suffered so much that eventually the Coalition ended up making every single mode available cross-play compatible, which did help the player base by a lot, so I'm grateful for that. But going back to the topic on hand, the results here look pretty good. 2666 MHz should be the target RAM speed here, as it offers almost 14% better performance for the average frame rate when compared to 2133 MHz, and we also see a whopping 27% improvement for the 1% lows. Then things seem to settle down with minor improvements, with bumps in frequency, and then tightening the timings for the RAM nets us a nice increase of 6% for the average frame rate. Nothing huge, but it's still nice to have. The next game on our list is an amazing looking RPG, The Witcher 3. This is another game which is also quite reliant on the CPU and will take advantage of multiple threads. Now, having your Ryzen CPU paired with a fast kit of RAM with decent timings is essential here. The experience I had with 2133 MHz and 2400 MHz was absolutely awful, as it was stuttering quite a lot. It wasn't until we hit 2666 MHz where we saw the 0.1% lows improve by 65% to reach an acceptable level at 33 FPS average, but it could definitely be better. With faster 3333 MHz RAM, we see the 0.1% lows average 56 frames per second, and now we're at a much more acceptable level, with the average frame rate also increasing 15% as well. Then with low latency RAM, we see much better frame times, and stutters were practically gone, and gameplay was overall very smooth. Next up is another RTS game, Civilization 6. For this benchmark, average FPS and frame times were not measured, but instead, the time it took for the AI to complete a turn is what we can use to see CPU performance. And as you guys can see from the results, not much needs to be said about this title. The game already does a pretty good job at taking advantage of the Ryzen CPUs, and regardless of whatever RAM configurations I was using, there were no noticeable changes to the turn times, as we're only looking at mere millisecond improvements here, so let's move on. For the next 3 games that we'll be taking a look at, they all share a very similar story when it comes to using different memory configurations. So I'll sum things up by saying that as long as you have a kit of RAM that's running at 2933 MHz or higher, you should be able to achieve the most out of your Ryzen processor. Middle-earth Shadow of War shows us a nice linear trend with all 3 measured stats incrementally improving with higher RAM configurations. Ghost Recon WildLands shows us that after 2933 MHz, the average frame rate hardly changes, but tightening the timings does help significantly with the 1% and 0.1% lows. Going from 3200 MHz to 3333 MHz with tighter timings shows an improvement of 20% for the 0.1% lows. Far Cry 5 is GPU bound for the most part, and the 1% and 0.1% results show negligible differences from 2400 MHz and onwards. Although looking at how much ground is covered in all these games, going from the lowest configuration to the highest, it does show how much potential there is with a Ryzen processor when paired with a fast, low latency kit of RAM. Kingdom Come Deliverance, a beautiful open-world RPG which takes place in the 1400s Bohemian era. Unfortunately, the game doesn't run as nice as it looks, and I'll say right off the bat, it is poorly optimized. Using RAM that's clocked lower than 3200 MHz would tank minimum performance to a point where the frame drops would become quite annoying. It wasn't until I ran the game with the memory running at 3333 MHz with fast timings that allowed me to sustain a more playable experience, as the 0.1% lows aren't too far from the 60 FPS mark. Slower configurations did introduce quite a bit of stuttering, but like I said earlier, this is just how the game is, and I don't think the hardware should be blamed for that. Ubisoft's latest addition to the Assassin's Creed series is Origins, and is by far their best looking game so far in my opinion. However, all that eye candy doesn't come without a price, as this game is quite taxing on the hardware. From the reports I've seen all over online, this game requires at least 6 cores or higher, since many users were finding even an overclocked quad-core i5 to become maxed out, which would cause a lot of stuttering. Going from 2666 MHz to 2933 MHz for the RAM allows for a 15% improvement to the 0.1% lows, but the 1% lows and average frame rate don't increase by a whole lot. Tightening the timings does allow the average frame rate to increase 7% as opposed to running the memory with auto timing mode enabled. The next game that I want to look at is Elder Scrolls Online, an MMORPG that I find myself coming back to every so often after hearing about some big update or expansion. Now, if I was to go on about why you should check this game out and how much it's changed since its release, this video would go on forever, so I'm not going to do that. I'll just keep it short by saying they've improved things drastically, and it's in a much better state now. So one of the reasons why I wanted to check this title out was because ZeniMax recently released a new Somerset chapter, which features a new zone, quests, dungeons, and everything that you'd expect from an expansion. But along with that, what caught my eye was that the developers stated they would be bringing true multi-core CPU support in this update. This update would provide better load balancing throughout all available cores and threads. Now, I haven't thoroughly tested this out for myself, but when I got my Ryzen CPU, I did a test a while back where I showed how underutilized the CPU was, where only one thread was utilized and the rest of the 15 threads were doing absolutely nothing. Now, the topic of this video is obviously how RAM speeds affect Ryzen, but I just wanted to explain why I threw this title in my benchmark suite. But as you guys can see from the results here, the game doesn't seem to care all too much about higher RAM frequencies, but we do see a significant uplift in performance with tightened timings. There is a pretty significant 47% uplift in performance regarding the 1% lows when the timings are tightened. Moving on, we have the most popular played game at the moment, Fortnite Battle Royale. Fortnite is a game that's very well optimized and doesn't really require any mid or high-end hardware to run at high frame rates. Even low-end hardware can do a really good job, but that doesn't necessarily mean that having a good CPU fast RAM, and fast GPU would go to waste. There's still a lot of headroom available, and if your hardware is up to the task, you can net yourself some even more performance. Just look at the differences between 2133 MHz and 3333 MHz with manually tuned timings. While even at the lowest configuration, we're seeing frame rates in the 100s, which is fantastic. Increasing performance further is still an option though, to allow for true high frame rate gaming. The last game we're going to take a look at is Counter-Strike Global Offensive, a popular Twitch shooter. Now Counter-Strike, just like Fortnite, will run like a dream even on really low-end hardware, but for a true CSGO enthusiast that wants to play at their best and doesn't want their system to hold them back, then investing in some good hardware to push your FPS as high as possible is essential. Through conducting all these benchmarks on CSGO, I learned that no matter the configuration you're running for your RAM, the 0.1% lows showed no change, and the 1% lows improved only ever so slightly. But it's the average frame rate which is impacted the most here, where we go from attaining an average frame rate of 317 frames per second all the way to 405 frames per second, so there's a pretty good boost in performance there. Now that we've seen all the gaming benchmarks separately, I thought I'd show you guys the 20 game average overall results with Civilization 6 being excluded since we measured time and not FPS or frame times there. And as you guys might expect, there are no surprises here after seeing all these benchmarks. What I'll say for a system like this, which is running a top-end Ryzen CPU with the best gaming graphics card currently on the market, 3200 MHz RAM seems to be a pretty good sweet spot to get the most out of your Ryzen system, with RAM configurations like 2133 MHz or 2400 MHz severely holding the CPU back. Of course, we also see the positive impacts of tightening timings to reduce memory latency. The difference in terms of performance between 3333 MHz and 3200 MHz with auto timing mode enabled was basically unnoticeable for almost all titles. So it hardly looks like there's any point in overclocking for that extra 133 MHz. But combine that with low timings, and now we're looking at a much more reasonable and substantial performance improvement. With 3333 MHz with tightened timings, the average frame rate improved 9%, with the 1% and 0.1% lows showing an 11% and 15% improvement respectively, which helps in CPU-bound games that are common with frame time spikes. So that should help alleviate and smooth things out. But if you want to take a look at things from a broader scope, you can see just how greatly things have improved simply going from the slowest configuration to the fastest. With DDR4 3333 MHz, the average frame rate increased 32%, with the 1% and 0.1% lows improving 37% and a whopping 49% respectively. If someone wants to get the most out of their current Ryzen system, and they have slow 2133 or 2400 MHz RAM, then upgrading that system with fast 3200 or 3400 low latency RAM would be quite the substantial upgrade. With all that said though, there are some crucial things to consider here before you go running off to pick up some fast BDI memory to pair with your Ryzen CPU. First off, you must evaluate the state of your system and its setup. What type of graphics card is in your Ryzen system? If it's a GTX 1060 or RX 580 or even below that, then you really don't have to worry about using fast low latency memory because it will hardly make a difference. You're still going to be GPU bottlenecked majority of the time, even at 1080p. If you're using a more higher end graphics card like the GTX 1070 Ti or above, or if you're using an AMD RX Vega 64, then yeah, apart from overclocking your CPU, fast low latency memory can really help the GPU stretch its legs. The other thing you must also consider is what resolution you're playing at, and along with that, what's your monitor's refresh rate. Starting with the latter here, if you're playing on a 60Hz monitor, you won't notice the differences these higher speeds will provide, except for the better frame times and less stutters in those really CPU sensitive games like The Witcher 3, Rise of the Tomb Raider, or even Hitman 2016. So unless you spend a lot of time playing those games, then I guess there is an exception for you there. However, if you have a 144Hz or 240Hz monitor, it makes sense as you guys will be able to notice the perceivable difference going from a slow kit of RAM to a fast one. Many games we saw push their average frame rates into the mid to high 100 range, and games like Battlefield 1, CSGO, and many of those racing games did show that improvement. And that's important because it will fully allow you to take advantage of your high refresh rate monitor. As for resolution, looking at how most games are in their current state in regards to optimization and things like that, 1440p or higher resolutions will cause you to run into a GPU bottleneck majority of the time, even with a high-end GPU like the 1080 Ti. But that's not to say things can't change in the future. As more and more faster GPUs come out in the future, things will start to look like what we see on 1080p now. But that's assuming if GPUs only get faster and games remain the same, because the latter will not stay the same and likely also change as well. Talking about resolutions can kind of open a can of worms, because we could see games that do come out in the future that do take advantage of multiple CPU cores and threads regardless of higher resolutions. So in that case, having a fast CPU with a good memory kit would be a lot more relevant in this situation. Moving on to another very important matter that I wanted to talk about was that I also wanted to bring to your guys' attention at just how ridiculous RAM prices have become. Because when your kit of RAM costs just as much, if not considerably more than your CPU, then you've got a serious problem on your hands with how to manage your budget accordingly. When I ordered my Ryzen 7 1800X, I had shortly learned soon after that a good quality Samsung B-die kit is recommended to ensure good compatibility and stability. So I ordered that G-Skill Trident Z kit for 180 Canadian dollars, which I thought at the time was already somewhat overpriced. But now the cost of B-die RAM has skyrocketed to insane levels. This same kit of RAM, now just a little over a year later, is 290 Canadian dollars, an increase of 61%. This kit costs the same as a Ryzen 5 2600X 6-core and 12-thread processor. So you really have to ask yourself, is it worth it to you? And the only person who can really answer that question is yourself. Of course, there will always be that minority that will have the money to blow and buy the fastest kit they can get, but most people will be budgeting accordingly and probably won't find it worth it. Me personally, if I was building my Ryzen system now and I had to choose a kit of RAM, to be honest, I would just choose the cheapest 3000 MHz kit and I could find, and I'd probably just try my luck at overclocking it myself. Because while there is a nice performance boost using this fast, low latency memory, I do not think it's worth $80 to $100 worth performance. And going back to what I said earlier about the Ryzen platform having trouble with memory stability and compatibility, that was referencing all the issues that were ongoing at the launch period of Ryzen Gen 1. There have been many updates released by AMD and motherboard manufacturers which have alleviated most of those issues, so you don't have to worry about getting a Samsung B-die kit of RAM. So that pretty much wraps up this video. I hope that these benchmarks and information was helpful to you guys and entertaining. Leave your questions and thoughts down below, check out the video description for my other videos and links to support the channel. Also, if you're interested in seeing more content like that, then make sure you're subscribed. Thank you so much for watching, take care, and I'll see you in the next one.